Hello, we're going to pick up this week where we left off last week, and we were on Chapter 6, page 88, and we got to the point where we were trying to run some of these commands, and they weren't quite working for us. What we did manage to do before we quit was basically create a user that we put into our database, and this command here is the part that actually does that. And then that was also stored in a variable called user. So that was active in memory last time we operated. Additionally, we created a profile by running this command and then assigning all that to the value of profile. In other words, creating the database entry, but also putting all those values into this variable. So what we need to do at this point, because our session has ended from the previous time, is we have to basically get that stuff back into memory so that we can run the subsequent commands and have them work. So what I'm going to actually have us do is I would like you to download and install SQLite Browser if you don't have it. If you do have it, just go to your Start menu and start typing SQLite Browser. I don't know if you have it added to your Start menu, but wherever you downloaded it to, if I remember right, this is just a simple exe file. So do a quick Google search for this and download it, because what I'm going to have us do is come in here and delete these entries. So this record here, which is the Jane Doe, this is the profile. And actually I should show you how to get to this point because I'm already on the table. Once you open up the product, you'll want to go to Open Database, and then you're going to navigate to wherever your project is located. In my case, it's in my blog folder, and then for you it should also be under Database. And since we're doing development work, it's going to be the development database that we're going to be opening. And it should be pretty intuitive because this one's got data and the others don't. So it should be a pretty easy thing. So open your database, and then typically you'll land on the structure page where you can see all the different tables and components and schemas and everything. But click on this Browse tab, and then you'll get a listing of all the tables. The one thing we need to do is we need to remove this record from the database. So I'm going to delete this one. So that's one for Jane Doe. And remember, the reason we're doing that is because we're going to add it back in just a moment. And then I'm also coming to the user table, and I'm going to delete this entry as well. So I'm going to delete the record. And now once we have that done, we're going to come back and we are going to get into the Rails console at the prompt. So let's bring up a command prompt window, and then I suggest that you change to the correct folder. And then just type Rails console at the prompt. Okay, now we have our prompt that we can work with here. All right, let's go ahead and load up this whole command here. Want to be careful of it pasting in properly. I'm not always comfortable with the fact that it does this, where the whole command is there, but you don't see it all at once. But I'm just basically, arrowing through it just to make sure that everything is the way it ought to be. And it looks fine. So that being the case, I'm going to press enter. All right, and it's throwing back a whole bunch of errors. Are you guys getting the same thing? Okay, yeah, I brought up the command prompt, and then I copied this particular command. Okay, so let's see if we got it in there correctly. It looked correct to me. Yours worked? Okay. Well, if you get a begin transaction and a commit, okay, so then yours worked just fine. Now, did you delete the entries from the database? You didn't even, okay. All right, so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go take a look at the database because I'm worried about corrupting data. I'm going to do a refresh here, and nothing did write to the database. So let me try to paste that in one more time. This time I'm going to buffer it in Notepad++. It looks like it's all reading as one line correctly. All right, once again I'm running into the same issue. Okay, do you see the message that I'm getting here? Should have probably read it the first time. It says, active record statement invalid, SQLite 3 busy exception, database is locked. So what would lock a database, you guys? See, I have a talkative bunch here tonight. What would lock a database? Yeah, if I'm getting a message like the one I just received, I want you to kind of reason through why that might be the case. It's trying to insert information into the table. It began the transaction, it gathered up the command and put it into a format that the database is going to receive, right? It's using SQL syntax. And then it's rolling back the transaction because it's saying that there's a busy exception. Database is locked. Do you know why database is locked? Whenever you're working with any particular record in a table, so if I have a table and I'm editing any of the fields in one row, that is not writable until it's done being written. So in other words, databases, the way they work is they work on the fly. So in other words, if I create a record or I'm in a record making an edit, as long as I'm in there and active, that particular record is basically, not available for manipulation. And that's to prevent data corruption. I mean, otherwise it would force the data in and it wouldn't work. So now my question becomes, what is active like that? The thought is it has to be the user table, right? But you can see that it's empty. So I'm thinking I'm just going to go ahead and create a new record here. See if it allows me. And I better pause for a second and plug in. Okay, so we're just going to do a little more experimentation here to see if we can figure this out. I created a new record. I'm going to run the command again and see if it overcomes the state of being locked. Now, if I don't overcome this, I'm going to do what some other people in the room here have done, which is basically they just ran the commands without deleting stuff from the database. The other thing that I can do is I can also, because I was clever enough to make a backup right before I began, I can pull in the database from my backup. So that's one of your advantages there. So I'm going to try that. So I'm going to actually exit out of the console. Just going to type exit, and then just through Windows I'm going to go in, take my backed up version I just created. I'm going to copy that. And I'm also going to, oh, I see the problem. So here I am in the process of copying the database. I'll tell you what just happened in my head. And I'm like, well, I better close the database. So I was looking here, and then I noticed, see the little button here? It says write changes. It didn't write any of the stuff I did. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete that record I just added, and now I'm going to write the changes. And now let's see if the command will work. So it's kind of exiting out a little too quick, so I'm glad I saw that. Okay, it worked. Great. Saw that rigmarole just because of that. All right, so now let's do the next command. The next one's going to be the profile one. This one I think I will have to edit in Notepad++ to make it work, because it is coming in as 2 lines. I want you to try this one as well, you guys. All right, so I'm looking at the output here, and this one's saying it's rolling back the transaction. And I guess I'm a little concerned that the data's not getting into the database, so once again, I'm going to take a look here. Yeah, it did not write to the database. So let's try to figure out why this is happening. Did we have a problem with this command last time, you guys? Do you remember?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought so. All right, let's examine the command and see if there's any clues here. Or did it work? Right? It had us create John Doe, Ruby developer. Is today the 27th? Nope.
I think it did actually work. I don't know why it says rollback, though. That's the weird part about it.
Yeah. All right. Or maybe it's just not doing it because it's already there. So what I'm actually going to do once again, you guys, is I'm going to delete this record. The reason I'm deleting it is more for the fact that when we're creating it, it stores into the variable. So I want it to store there. My concern is that it's not storing into the variable. Now, of course, I could always check that at the prompt by just typing profile. Okay, well, actually, it is in memory. So, so I'm not going to do any drastic maneuvers, no deletions from the database. Now I'm going to see if these next commands are going to work, because I think we got stuck here. So basically what we're looking at is the reason it's trying to commit the transaction, roll back the transaction, is because that information's already there. Now if this doesn't work, the next series of commands, then I am going to come back and I'm going to try to delete that database entry and then rerun the command. So that's kind of the backup plan. But let's proceed as if everything will be perfect, because I have the feeling that it will be. So let's go ahead and type user.profile. And you saw the output that's expected there, right? All right. It does come back with a nil. Excuse me. So let's talk about in essence what it's trying to do. Really what it's looking at is because we took both of those things and populated them as variables, we can start to chain them together. So it realizes that if I have a user.profile, and remember, user is populated as a variable with one particular user already placed inside of it, as is profile. The thing that's happening though is, take a look at the database real quick. Right now we have a user. He does not have a user ID. So if I go to the user table and I'm trying to link this record with the other table, it's not going to work. Well, part of the problem here is that thanks to the little changes that I did, that our user ID is off, for one thing. But in this case, it's recognizing that we don't have a link between the two, and that's really kind of what we're trying to create here. So one thing that we're going to end up doing is when we're going to be asked to put in this information, I'm sure that's coming up, the user ID, so that it links, they'll probably ask us to put in a 1, but we'll put in a 2 because that's actually the user ID. All right, so just please keep that in mind. All right, so here, profile, user ID is nil, just verifying. One thing they want us to do now is they want us to link these two things together. So they're going to have us type this command where it's going to be user.profile equals profile. Type that in, and you can see that it actually worked. But what it automatically did, and we can go back to the database and take a look. We can see it in the text there as well, but it's kind of nice to look at it here. You see what it did? It created another record with the same John Doe. It gave it a user ID of 2 and a new record ID. So it created the user ID dynamically by linking it to user automatically. Remember, user was loaded into memory, and then in order to populate user.profile, we fed profile into it, and then it did the work. It's kind of a powerful little concept there. So hopefully, I'm hoping you understood what just happened there, but just to reiterate, is we had the user created in memory, so this information that we entered was in memory. Then we created profile, and both of these things got written to the database, and here we tried to enforce an association, but really the profile part of it isn't populated in this because it chains off of users. So in order to populate it, we had to say user profile equals profile. It took all that profile information from up here, and then it associated it with user. So not only did it make, basically copy information, but it discovered through its architecture that that user and that profile are now linked together. And that's evidenced by looking at the database directly. User ID is 2, and then the profile's user ID is 2. So this links back to the user ID, the ID column in the user table. All right, let's move on to the next command here. We should now be able to type user.profile, and that association should now be forged. So I type user.profile, that's right here, and now it's showing the same stuff that we were looking at in the database, where it's combining basically the two tables. So it really is focusing on profile, but it's making that link based on that user ID. Now the neat thing about that is once we have an association forged, then we have additional things that we can do, like this. So it says here user, and it's create underscore profile. You can guess what that does. And that leverages the pre-created things that we've been working with. So I remember if you look back a few pages, and this create underscore is kind of one of these built-ins, and we're just using the variable name that we created, which has that association attached to it now. And now we're going to throw in Jane Doe and color pink, which I think we did last time, so I guess we're doing it again. All right, so this is where our command was. Begin transaction, writes our SQL statement, commits it to the database, does another transaction. But notice what this one's doing. Basically it's doing a series of two steps here. It says insert into profiles, it gives the order of the columns. Then notice the values. The values are all question mark. But then following those question marks, we have in square brackets basically an array here. User ID 2, name Jane Doe, color pink, and then the timestamps. And now these are system generated by the commands that we typed in. Then they get written. Then we do the next transaction where it's taking that information and now it's updating it. So it's updating profiles. Notice what it's doing, set user ID, updated at, where, and all the question marks that we have in that spot, all of which are going to be basically passed in with the stuff that we have created. So when you look at the output of all of that, it's got all this information already linked together. It's kind of fun, actually, I think, to go look at the database now and just do a refresh. Notice that we do have Jane Doe. Notice that Jane Doe just broke our association with John Doe. Right, because the one mistake that we made here, remember when I said that we had to keep in mind that we were one ID number off? Well, I just set Jane Doe to be John Doe. So even though it's probably highly inappropriate, I'm probably at some point going to have to either change these manually. Well, you know what? I'll just keep rolling with it and see if we run into any problems. But I don't anticipate it'll be too hard to fix. Because really, this should have been 2, and that should be 3. All right, in fact, folks, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to force that change. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to change this to a 1, if it'll let me. And then I'm going to go to Profiles. I'm going to leave that as a 2, but I'm going to make that a 1. And then I'm going to write the changes. I'm doing this to kind of put myself in the correct state so that if I do subsequent exercises and we're throwing in a different ID numbers, that they're the right ones and that they'll work. I will make the disclaimer that this could totally break it, but oh well. Right? Worst case scenario is we start over. That's why you make backups. All right, let's move on to the next step here. This next little table that they're looking at is basically a table full of different functions or methods that are available to us just by simply using the has-one association. So that's the one-to-many setup. All right, so I can bring back the profile. This one here will take whatever profile is in memory and actually store it. Checks to see if there is no profile that's associated. This one will actually build a profile, and you can pump in the attributes or some of the ones that we were just running. One of the ones we just ran, which is to create the profile, and then you pass in all of the attributes. All right, so at this point we can try some of these commands, and you can see that it's going to give us a certain amount of output. And they're giving us kind of like the generic ... because they, know it's not going to do anything too significant here. I'll just run it again so you can see what it does. None of these are really critical at this point, but it's just demonstrating the concepts from that table. So I'm going to run this one. Of course, this is going to be a little strange because it's asking us to build a profile. And all it's going to do is, in the biography, it's going to say eats leaves. And you can see it went ahead and did it. It wasn't really all too picky. So I should be able to see that in here now. Or apparently not. Did you guys try that one? Did it work for you? I'm running this one here. And, yeah, I think what's happening to me now is I'm getting this little version number difference, which isn't very critical because I can manually add that stuff in. Okay, so this time it looks like it did put it in there. So I'm not sure why it's not updating here, because it's showing differently. So there you go. Okay, so it is coming in there. Just seems like it's slightly delayed. All right, another thing that we can do is, and once again, this is related to the has-one. Some little extensions that we can add to our commands. So you can put in the class name if there is a class associated with it. You can add some conditions. You guys know what foreign keys are, right? It's a link to a primary key in a different table. You should know that. You can also order things, and then you can also forge dependencies. So, for example, the way a dependency works is if one thing is dependent on another, and that other thing you delete, then you have really no use for the one that's still sitting there. So, therefore, if you get rid of it, it'll go with. All right, so the thing that we're going to do next is we're going to create one-to-many associations. And I think we talked about this last time, but we didn't actually code it. What is happening here is instead of has one, we're going to do has many. And it will make a lot of sense if you think about, a blog, that one person that authors or one of the users might create many different articles. So that's why we would have a has many relationship. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to jump out of the interactive Ruby prompt. So if you're still in that prompt, which you should be, just go ahead and type exit, and then you'll come out of there. And then we're going to be typing this longer command. And this is another one of these scaffolding type of commands, except this time we're doing a migration. Remember, the migration is going to read through all those migration files that we created, and it will rebuild the database. And notice that there's a little bit of a command here. It says add user ID to articles, and it's setting the name of the column and the data type. So that's kind of interesting that we can just do that from a command line. So just kind of like brute force command line, we're adding a column, we're setting a data type, and the model will generate, and then we're going to have to go in and do a little bit of work to, of course, actuate all of that. But by adding a user ID column to any of the articles, that way we can attribute an article to a user, and then the user attributes it to a profile. So you see the links that are happening here. But it's a very elegant command considering what you're doing, and you just do it with a little bit of code. Let's go ahead and type that in. All right, and hopefully you guys had the same success. You can see that what it did is it did create in the migration folder under database a time-stamped Ruby file. And if you do a little comparison of how the command is structured and what happens, so we're invoking the Rails command structure. We're telling it to generate a migration. This is the name of the migration. Notice the really verbose language they use. So they wrote a migration that says exactly what we're doing. We're adding user ID to articles. So that way there's no guessing. And once again, set up the column and the data type. All right, next thing we want to do is we want to go look at that file in the text editor. Let's go open it up. And let's do a little bit of a comparison here to what's in our book. All right, so take a look at the code. Notice that it's going to run a method called change. That figures out that it needs to add a column. Where is it adding it to? Articles. What's it adding? The user ID. What is that? An integer. So that's like the language that's happening here. Now, in order for this to stick, kind of like the same thing I was doing before where I forgot to write the changes to the database in that interface, I have to do the same thing from the command line to basically rebuild that article table. So I'm going to run the command rake db migrate. And that's a common thing. Whenever you're going to generate any sort of a change or create a new migration of some sort, you have to actually run the migration. And that is the command that you use, rake db migrate. Shouldn't take too long, but it does go through all those migration files which help to build the models, and it creates that file. You can see that it succeeded. So now that should be available to us. And one way to double check that once again is to go to the articles table. And I think that we need to refresh. And the thing that I'm curious about, okay, so there's a new column. In terms of browsing the data, okay, so I basically just put the column at the end, so I was missing it. But now that that column is there, we can make that link that basically force that relationship. All right, let's go ahead and look at this other file here. So we're going to go to App Models Article. So drop down to the root of the project, App Models Article. Let's open it up. And then take a look at the code inside there. We do have some of it. We also have the validates presence of title and body, so that's the Ruby way to enforce validation. But we do need to add these little bits here which help to enforce that relationship. So we're going to paste in belongs to user and go ahead and save it. And then we're going to do the same thing with the user RB file, which is in the same folder. And then let's just make sure that all the code is right. It has one profile and has many articles. So all of this is kind of primitive, and I think the syntax is a little strange at first. It does kind of make sense after you play with it for a little bit. Okay? Because think about just verbally, just reading through it. User has one profile. User has many articles. It actually reads pretty clear compared to a lot of other languages. Once again, save your file. All right. So now they want us to go ahead and drop back down to the Rails console. So let's do that. You know, and in fact, one way that we can do this is we can leave the one command prompt window at a regular prompt, and we can just open up a separate one. Let's go right to our folder here. And then we'll run Rails console. I'm hoping that with all this goofing around at the command line, you guys are feeling a little bit more comfortable with that. It's not really a big deal. It's really a matter of knowing the right commands. And if commands are a little bit off, it'll tell you. All right, so it wants us to do a reload exclamation point. All right, succeeded. All right, and the next command I think is pretty intuitive. We're setting up a variable that's going to hold the first user that's listed in the database. Next thing we're going to run is user articles. And the point of this, it's going to come back with something empty because there isn't any association yet. That user doesn't have any articles associated with them. So guess what the next step is probably going to be? And this is kind of interesting syntax because we're kind of using a combination of two different things. So we're saying user.articles, and see the double brackets there? So the user.articles is, in essence, it's kind of like receiving article.first. So it's going to find the first article and attribute it to the user's articles. All right, let's go ahead and run it. Sets up the query. No error messages. Looks like it did the commit. Let's go back to the database tool here. And I'm going to take a look at users. That's unchanged. Articles. So notice how the first article now has user ID 1. And we did that just with that simple little command, which I don't see anywhere on the screen now. There it is. Now remember, this worked because of the stuff that we had previously loaded into memory. So we ran a variable called user, which grabbed the first user, so that's what's in there. Then user has how many articles? Has many articles, right? But one of those is going to be article first. And because of that association that we established, it knows what we mean and intelligently enters the right user ID into the table for us. All right, let's run this other command. We're going to do user.articles.size. Press enter, and that's right, because in our articles table we only have one article that's attributed to that particular user, which happens to be the first user. If I go ahead and just run user.articles, now you're going to see it's going to bring back the information for the articles that are actually attributed to them. All right, we took a little break here in class and we're coming back and we were just having a little discussion, basically reviewing these steps and what they mean. And we're about to step ahead now to this spot. So what we're going to do is we're going to run a command that's almost kind of in reverse, it seems. But it really kind of shows you how it pulls information from the database and from the model. So we ran article.first before, and that was to take that first article that's in the database and attribute it through this association to a user. So there's an association between the articles and the user by virtue of these Ruby files that we were messing with. So articles belong to a user, and the user has many articles. And that association is represented in that command right here. By taking article.first, which obviously pulls back that first article, and we assign it basically to that user, Forges takes all those relationships, figures it out, takes the first article, and attributes it to the user. So that's kind of like a reiteration of all that just for clarity. The next command, and I forget if I pasted it in already, this part we know what it does. Article.first is going to pull back the first article, and then when I say user ID, all it's going to do is put back up on the screen the number 1, which is the ID of the first user. So it's telling us who that user is. Basically as simple as that. Next command, which is similar. Now this one's not looking at the user ID. This one's looking at the user. So what is it doing? It's loading the article. So you can see it's running the SQL command to do that. It's loading up the user. So by loading up the article, it looks at the ID, then it loads the user. See, it looks for ID. And then it comes in here and it gives us, as a result of that action, it says that the user ID is 1. This is the user's information. And that's the same stuff that pulls up from the database. So once we have that, information in the database, then you have this like flexible syntax to figure out who's who and what the information is. And I'm assuming, unless I hear any squawking in the background here, that everybody's got it working okay and hopefully understanding it. Right, just like we did for the has one keyword, has many has a whole bunch of different methods that go with it. Some of them we've already played with a little bit, so I'm not really going to go over those. And I think a lot of them are very intuitive, like user articles empty. The question mark is you're asking a question. What's the size? Article IDs, clear, find. And then of course you have these other ones here where you can build or populate or create basically new stuff and pass attributes to it directly. So I think very, very much so these are pretty clear. All right, so let's keep typing these commands in. So this one says user articles again. Of course, that brings back all the articles attributed to that user. Just happens to be one. But now we're going to run a little bit more complicated command, and then you're going to see the difference here. I am using Notepad++ to act as a little buffer because I knew the lines weren't going to split well. All right, so before I go pasting it at the prompt, let's just read what it says. It says user articles. That we're familiar with, right? That indicates that there's an association between these two things. We already saw what these little pointers do. They're going to take whatever the result of this method is and then put it into this association and basically forge that association and make it stick. So the method that we're going to run is new, and you can see that new, we pass to it a bunch of different attributes, column names, and then the data that goes into the columns. So we're putting in the title, a body, and that's it. So let's paste this in the prompt. All right, and you can see that it succeeded. So it's got article ID 5. And then if you look right here, you can see now that there's a second article, article ID 10. Once again, it's handy to have the database sitting there open, and you can see, the data that's going in. So those are the articles. Notice ID 10, ID 5. So those are the ones attributed to that user's articles. So that's what that means basically. So user.articles, we just did that double pointer and threw this information in there, and it works. If we go ahead now and run this next command, this will pull back the ID numbers of those articles, and in our case it should be 5 and 10. We just saw that in the database. Yours might be different. Remember, I've been tinkering with mine probably in ways I shouldn't. And then if we type in this command, it's going to pull in the first article, which is the one with ID of 5. And basically, I'm hoping you're seeing that this is pretty darn intuitive. And now we're going to run this command, which does a clear. So what does that do exactly? Well, let's see what the table says. Clears all associated objects from the association by setting their foreign keys to null. So user articles clear. Let's go back to our SQLite browser here. You can see the user IDs went away. It broke the association. Very simple little command, very powerful. Alright, so now if we do a count, of course, it should read 0. Right, because we broke the associations. But if we do an article.count, okay, in my case it says 4. They only have 2. But if I look at my database, I do see that I have 4 articles. Right, so you see how that matches up. Okay, our next command spans 2 pages, so I'm going to have to copy paste this piecemeal. Maybe in some ways that's better. And let's take all of that. Now, before I press enter, let's take a look at what it's doing. All right, so once again, it's working on that relationship, user.articles. We're going to do a create. And what it's doing is it's creating a title, it's creating a body, and that's it. Any anticipations is what's going to happen into the database? Well, let's take a look at the database. Let's do a refresh. You can see it added another article, but notice the user ID is set to 1. The reason that happens is because we have that portion of the command, user.articles, and remember, a little ways back, we set user equivalent to the first user in the table. There's an association with articles. We're running a method called create. So we're creating an article associated to the first user. This is how it reads. And this is the information that's going in. And you see, it really is painfully simple syntax, especially once you start to get the hang of what it all means. All right. Just as with has one, there's a lot of different options. Once again, you see exactly the same options here: classes, conditions, foreign keys, orders, and dependencies. All right, I think this is a good spot to stop this video and start a fresh one, because I think this one's getting a little bit on the long side. So we'll be back in just a moment.